Good evening, everyone. I'm taking you all away from the waves of discussion we did in last 5 days, diagnostic and curative to palliative. Fortunately or unfortunately, end of life care is one of my favorite topic. Uh, so let's start. I'm Dr. Santosh Kumar Singh. I am in charge of hematology ICU, IMS and some hospital. And two things matter. One is a dignity and another is human values. A patient is a person, and every person, whether well or ill, has the right to be treated with human dignity. Everyone with a life limiting illness has a right to a life free from pain, symptoms, and distress. These are two prototype cases I would like to start with. One is a 56-year-old glioblastoma multiforme diagnosed 2 years back, received with GCS of E3, V1 and M4, intubated and survived 35 days in ICU until he had a VAP and septic shock. Another case is a 43-year-old stage 4 CA lungs post chemotherapy received with tachypnea, tachycardia and hypotension. I initiated end of life care discussion after taking care of his ABCs, but later I found what I found I will say in my last slide. What is unique about ICU and an intensive care specialist? ICU is one of the most advanced form of modern healthcare. It is a place where medical science works with medical arts not only to save lives but to make lives better. An intensive care specialist is unique among all the doctors as he has the scope to look into all the aspects of his or her patient's life in a very short span of life. An intensive care specialist is one of the significant healthcare leader and a potential contributor to the hospital policies. Now let's see what is the difference between Indian practice of medicine and Western practice of medicine. Indian practice is mostly trust based from very ancient period of time. People think that the doctor knows the best and the doctor takes most of the decisions in a patient's course of illness, whereas in the western practice it is mostly autonomy based. A capable patient will take decisions for himself or herself. Exceptions are there in both sides, but now the Indian practice is changing. It is getting more of autonomy based. Now let's see how hematological patients are different from other patients. If you visit a dedicated hematological ICU, you will find these kinds of patients. The first category is the bone marrow transplant candidates and patients admitted for high risk medications. Then second category is acute onset catastrophic diseases like AML with tremolysis syndrome plus minus sepsis, thrombocytopenic intracranial hemorrhage, acute chest syndrome of sickle cell disease, AML with blast crisis. Third category patients are hematological patients with non-hematological diseases like AML plus myocardial infarctions, AML with dyselectrolytemia, treatment-related complications. Fourth category is relapsed resistant chronic cases with complications. Fifth category are referred cases from various other hospitals due to progressive disease. So the first three categories of patients, they get the highest priority, and the last two cases they usually, according to my experience, they usually go into palliative care and mostly end of life care. And the patients will be having these kinds of problems. First is financial toxicity due to resource demanding diagnostic tests and treatment, need for recurrent and long term hospital admission, or loss of earning. Emotional toxicity, a lot of negativity exists with the diagnosis, worsening of the conditions of the fellow patients, anxiety. pharmacological toxicity leading to poor immunity, nutrition, and bleeding risks, high disease burden at the presentation, and lack of plasticity. So there is minimum chance of rehabilitative therapies. If you look into numbers, you'll see these are 72 cases admitted from 1st January to 31st March 2021 in hematology ICU, IMS, and some hospital. Out of these 72, 10 cases were candidates for palliative care. Out of them, one or two patients went home with palliative care treatment, and rest of the patients we had to initiate end of life care. This constitutes around 13.8%, around 14% of all the cases admitted during that time. This signifies how important it is to have a very good palliative and end of life care provision in the practice of hematological patients, specifically when they are critically ill. If you ever tried to look beyond chip complaint, history of present illness or past illness, you will see in a patient who has couple of months or days or weeks to live, you'll find that all these things goes on in a patient's mind. His emotional state, financial condition, religious belief, guilt, unfinished relationships, wishes, ambitions, social status, job, everything. So this is what a patient's life at the end. What is the role of an intensivist in the practice of end of life care? First is minimize suffering, even if the patient is having a life limiting illness, predicting survival, ensuring comfort, and controlling distress symptoms. When appropriate, initiate and implement palliative care in consultation with the primary attending, patient, family, and ICU nurse. Ensure medical, legal, and ethical appropriateness of modalities. Achieve consensus between teams, because there is often difference between the primary attending team and the intensive care team. So everyone should be taken into confidence before initiating or declaring a end of life care or a palliative care for a patient, which is there is a major shift in the goal of treatment. It is from curative to uh, comfort care. So the consensus between the teams is very important. Safeguard patients' dignity and autonomy, prompt identification of the dying patients, ensure proper documentation and information to the patient's attendant, ensure and develop proper hospital end of life care policy, lead the implementation, and review the process. This is a very famous graph depicting the course of illness of a patient. First is the screening phase or symptomatic phase, then there is diagnosis. The yellow one is the curative care, when the options of disease directed treatment is lost. The palliative care takes over. There is minimum disease directed treatment. Eventually, all the options are lost. It is decided to start end of life care. So there is no disease directed treatment, only comfort care is there. Eventually, there is death of the patient leading to bereavement phase. Now, look into the graph. This is my own graph, sorry. Um, the disease, the course of illness may look like this. There will be very minimum symptomatic phase. There is suddenly a diagnosis of leukemia or anything like this. Initiate therapy is initiated. The therapeutic window is lost. The curative window is lost. You will get minimum chance for activation of palliative care. Eventually, the thin red line exists, which shows the end of life care, and there may be a prolonged bereavement phase after death. So, what is the legal aspect of end of life care? So, the common law duty as a doctor, which is universal. It says that to take reasonable steps uh, to act for the patient's best interest. The law related to end of life care tends to emphasize on patient's autonomy. So, patient's autonomy is very important ethical aspect of end of life care practice. Adult with legal capacity is free to refuse medical treatment even if that is going to cut short his life. Indian legal guidelines do not put much light on moral and ethical dilemmas of end of life care discussion, and it focuses more on euthanasia, right to live, and this brain death, but do not put much emphasis on end of life care. End of life care and FLSTs, that is foregoing of life sustaining treatments, what options we give, DNR, DNI, are not euthanasia. This is clear that end of life care and FLSTs are not euthanasia. This is clear. Common law confers right of the patient to informed consent or refusal. It is sufficient for the FLSTs. I'll discuss in another slide what are the FLSTs. It is pronounced FLST as lawful when capable patient refuses treatment. When a capable patient can refuse treatment. Refusal to accept medical treatment is not attempt to suicide, and endorsement of FLSTs by the physicians does not constitute abatement of suicide. This is very important. This is protective actually. Refusal of the patients to accept treatment is not attempt to commit suicide, and endorsement of FLSTs by physicians do not constitute abatement of suicide. Now, care and decision making at the end of life. Like any difficult, complicated disease, end of life care is a multidisciplinary approach. The team constitutes the primary physician, the intensive care team, the nursing team, the palliative care team, the pain specialist, the rehabilitation and physiotherapist. All they constitute the team. It sees the patient as a whole person rather than an incurable disease or a person who is going to die. The process of care is not just limited to the patient, it extends to the family and caregivers. Objective of end of life care: to achieve a good death, to achieve a good quality of life and quality of death. It acknowledges that the end of life care is a human right, and every individual with a life limiting illness has a right to good, peaceful, and dignified death. What are the components, what are the principles of good death? The patient should know what is coming and what events are expected. He should have control over his pain and symptoms. He should have his dignity and privacy. He should have control over the time, place, and person, and he should have time to say goodbye to his family members. If he wants, he should be with his near and dear ones. What are the components of good death? First is adequate pain and symptom management, not only at present, but with a commitment that we will manage all the symptoms which are going to happen in future, like breathlessness and delirium, uh, clear decision making, good communication, good information sharing, clear decision making with physicians and family, and empowering the family in the decision making is very important. Preparation for death: the patient and patient's attendant should know what is going to happen in the next course of their illness. Completion: the patient's meaningfulness, spirituality should be uh, should be acknowledged. Contributing to others: if the patient wants, he can contribute financially, or he may place his organs or tissue for donation. This should be well respected. Affirmation of the whole person, the patient's whole life, values, preferences, accomplishments should be appreciated. States of EOLC: identify when to initiate EOLC and to whom to initiate, assess the physical symptoms and distress, assess the non-physical issues, assess the communication needs, then plan the site of care. It may be ICU or a private cabin, or patient sent back can be sent to home. Review existing care protocols, medications, charts, stop all the unnecessary interventions, medications, and investigations. Anticipatory prescriptions should be there. Communication, consent, and consensus should be built up. Provide access to essential medications like opioids. Dedicated space and around the clock staff should be provided to the patient. Special care needs of the patient and the family should be addressed. After death care and bereavement support should be initiated on time. Reassess, ensure the protocol plans are followed, and document each step. Reflect, review the care process, identify the gaps, and address the gaps promptly. Infrastructural requirements of EOLC. First and foremost is the policy. The hospital should have a solid end of life care policy approved by a competent authority. Space and staff should be there. Education and training of all level of healthcare providers. Documentation of end of life care pathway customized to the patient's need and illness. Physical symptoms, special support like hearsay van and morgue should be provided. There are four fundamental principles of end of life care. First is autonomy, second is beneficence, third is non malfeasance, fourth is distributive justice. Autonomy is respecting patient's choice and preferences. This is reflected in practice as the patient has got right to consent or refuse any medical intervention except in special circumstances. This should equally apply to life prolonging intervention. If the patient don't want to accept the treatment, he has all the rights to refuse if he is mentally capable of taking decisions. Second is beneficence. This is a fiduciary duty. This is an inherent obligation of all the doctors to act always in the patient's best interest. It is reflected in the practice that if curative intervention have got negligible benefit for the patient, or it is not going to help the patient, then FLST is often in the patient's best interest in terms of reducing the suffering and pain of the patient. This protects him from social and financial difficulties. Then malfeasance and double effect. It comes from the doctrine, first do no harm. No intervention should harm the patient, but should be properly explained, informed consent to be taken that we are giving such and such drugs which will reduce the symptoms, but it may decrease the lifespan of the patient. This is known as double effect. Distributive justice. This is allocating the limited resources equally in patients in order to maximize their benefits and minimize the wastage. When the patient's attendant, after knowing the futility of the treatment, demands full treatment, then it should be then conflict arises between distributive justice and autonomy. So a middle path can be negotiated after discussion. Communication during end of life care discussion is pivotal, and it is protective uh, for the practitioner from future legal issues. The goal of communication should be establishing consensus between the caregivers of all level. Everyone should know that this patient is an end of life care candidate. Provide accurate and appropriate information to the family. This maintains the transparency between the treating team and the family. Elicit and resolve all the concerns of the family during discussion. Conflict resolution: if there is some conflict, then it should be resolved in repeated sittings, and the help of legal advisor and ethical advisors should be taken during conflict resolution. Practically, this is not possible, but these kind of patient should be avoided for ICU admission. First is severe irreversible brain damage, irreversible multiple organ system failure, metastatic cancer unresponsive to chemotherapy and or radiation therapy, patients with decision making capacity who decline intensive care or monitoring, who wish to receive comfort care only. Fifth is brain dead non-organ donors. Sixth is patients in persistent vegetative states, patients who are permanently unconscious. But if it is not practically possible, this patient should be admitted to ICU for 2 to 3 days. Reasonably, all the reversible causes of deterioration should be ruled out, and proof of irreversibility of the disease should be noted and explained to the patient's attendants. Recognizing a dying patient is very easy for intensive care specialists. Progressive falling blood pressure and body temperature, altered breathing patterns, change in skin color, bedridden patient with decreased spontaneous movement, decreased response to question, no spontaneous verbalization, total detachment for the surrounding, nil interest in food, water, or medications, comatose state, severe cachexia. These are the signs of a dying patient. If found, then the family members should be informed immediately. These cases are considered to be futile, advanced stage with poor functional state and uh, multiple organ dysfunction, severe refractory illness with organ dysfunction unresponsive to reasonable period of aggressive treatment, coma due to acute catastrophic causes with irreversible consequences such as uh, traumatic brain injury, intracranial bleeding, extensive infection, chronic severe neurological conditions with advanced cognitive or functional impairment, progressive metastatic cancer with treatment options for which treatment options failed, post cardiorespiratory arrest with prolonged poor neurological status, any other situations which is predicted by physician to be of low probability of survival. Now summarizing the end of life care process: recognition of medical futility. Second step is honest, accurate, and early disclosure of prognosis to the family. Third is development of consensus among the caregivers. Fourth is discussion and communication of modalities of end of life care with the family. Fifth event is the death. Sixth is after death care. Seventh is bereavement support. During the whole process, conflict management, documentation, and review of the process goes on. Care in the last days of life. These are the common symptoms at the end of life in hematological patients: pain, breathlessness, respiratory secretions, agitation, delirium, restlessness, anguish, nausea, or vomiting. These are the common symptoms. Problems specific to the patients like seizures, bleeding, emergencies like spinal cord compressions, threatened airway. Pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage. In end of life care, total pain is addressed, means all the influencers should be addressed. Spiritual, for example, the patient thinks that he is suffering because of his past deeds. Psychological means he thinks that his pain is not going to be cured, it is incurable. Social, he thinks that he has become a burden for his family. These are all the things that affect the actual physical pain. Then assess the pain according to site severity, radiation, characters, timing, frequency, variation, quality, and descriptive terms, exacerbating and relieving factors, associated features. The WHO ladder for analgesia can be implemented. Step 1 is non-opioid plus adjuvant. Step 2 is opioid plus non-opioid. Third is opioid, non-opioid plus or minus adjuvant therapy. These are the adjuvant therapies we can use in pain management. Steroids for capsule stretching pains like pain of splenomegaly or hepatomegaly. Antidepressant for neuropathic pains. Uh, Muscle relaxant for muscle cramp and spasms. Bisphosphonate for bone pain. Antispasmodics for bowel colic and bladder spasm. Additional interventions like spinal analgesia, nerve block, and radiotherapy, surgical stabilization can be used. Non-measures like TENS and acupuncture can be used. Rehabilitative supports like physiotherapy and occupational therapies. Nausea and vomiting can be addressed according to the possible etiology. For metabolic, it is haloperidol, gastric status, prokinetics, organ damage, cyclism, bile obstruction, conservative versus surgical according to the patient's choice and decision. For raised ICP, steroids and cyclism, psychological, benzodiazepines, and post-operative ondansetron and granisetron. For unknown cases, mostly it is metabolic haloperidol can be used. Restlessness, agitation, and delirium. Consider common causes like urinary retention, fetal impaction, pain. Allow a calm environment, familiar voice, gentle and usual routine should be there. Patient on regular or long-term benzodiazepines should continue with it. In case of restlessness and agitation, midazolam can be used. For psychosis or delirium, haloperidol is given, but it should be kept in mind that restlessness or agitation should be distinguished from psychosis or delirium, because in case of psychosis or delirium, if we give midazolam, it will take the patient into a uh, cloudy state, and it further increases the confusion and psychosis. Respiratory tract secretions, it should be prevented. If it is already present, it cannot be removed with medications. For drainage, keep proper reassurance and explanation. Positioning, consider stopping parenteral fluids. Give hourly mouth care. For further accumulation of secretions, give hyoscine or glycopyrrolium. If secretions are absent, then anticipatory prescription should be given with hyoscine or glycopyrrolium. Breathlessness can be a terminal event. Take general measures like calm environment, reassurance, support, gentle airflow, cool room, give hourly mouth care, oxygen if saturations are low. If patient already on opioid for pain, give midazolam. If patient not on opioid, then give morphine 2.5 milligram IV. Emergencies are seizures, give midazolam. Repeated doses can be given. For malignant superior vena cava obstruction, head up position, steroid, anticoagulation, and surgical oncology consultation can be given. For major hemorrhage, proper explanation and reassurance should be given. If resuscitation is inappropriate, then consider crisis midazolam of 10 milligram IV start. Opioid toxicity, stop opioid, secure IV access, give 0.5 ml of naloxone. For malignant hypercalcemia, hydrate the patient with normal saline, uh, then followed by IV bisphosphonate injection. What are the foregoing of life-sustaining treatments? All needs informed consent, and explanation of possible side effects. These are three categories. One is DNR, no resuscitation at all. Second is full code, that is CPR plus ACLS plus shock if required, intubation and vasopressors. Modified resuscitation like do not intubate, CPR only or vasopressor only resuscitation. All should be explained with informed consent. Organ and tissue donation, if the patient has wish to donate organ or tissue, it should be respected. It is an integral part of end of life care. If the patient is capable of donating organ, then it should be encouraged. So why end of life care practice is difficult and feels impractical? Because first, our training, it makes us naturally aggressive and curative rather than palliative in specific cases. Lack of awareness and hospital end of life care policy, gap in various services, there is difference of opinion, various cultures and communities, they see and accept death differently, emotional attachments, family pressure, and most of our patients are self-funding rather than state-funded. The level of treatment is influenced by or may determined by the account balance, social status. That means the autonomy takes over the distributive justice, fear and ambiguity associated with legal consequences, fantastic movies showing patient jumping out of deathbeds. End of life care is shifting of priority, not shifting of responsibility. This should be understood. Now coming back to the two prototype cases, 56-year-old glioblastoma multiforme who was suffering for last 2 years. I was more focused on protecting the airway rather than giving end of life care discussion or FLST options. I could have discussed with the family members. Second case, the stage 4 CA lungs. I was too early to start end of life care discussion, thinking that the breathlessness is the terminal symptom of that patient. Around 1.5 hours back, later, when I did a rush protocol and a DVT screening, I found there is a DVT and there is dilated RA and RV. It was thrombolyzed with STK and the patient was doing fine, reasonably fine, and symptoms minimized, and he was out of vasopressors and NIV within next 12 to 24 hours. So end of life care, before initiating end of life care or end of life care discussion, I should have ruled out the reversible causes. These are my references. Now coming to the end, I would like to say it is not end of life care, it is life care. And end of life care is not meant to make the death easy, it is to make the life easy. And working with these patients has taught me that live well is better than live longer. Grounded, it made me grounded and humble. It made me more human. Thank you.